You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by author, podcaster, and journalist Richard Foster to talk to us about his book, Southern Nightmare, The Hunt for the Southside Strangler, which is our book club selection for July. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Richard, we were talking about this off air. We've been talking about having you on Mind Over Murder for 3 years, and it's our failing that we haven't had you on until now.
No, not at all. We were saying I've been fairly busy for the last several years, so it's not a problem. I'm looking forward to it.
Start by telling us a little bit about your professional background.
I have been in journalism and communications for a little over 30 years. I started working as a working journalist when I was still in college at Virginia Commonwealth University, writing for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I was a reporter on their state desk and business desk when I was still in college. Over the years, I've worked for several daily papers. I've been an editor for a news site, City Magazine, and I'm currently editor of Virginia Business Magazine, which is a monthly glossy. And over the years, I've done a little bit of everything. I've written a couple of books. I've done a lot of investigative writing, profiles, government reporting, entertainment writing, a little bit of everything.
Now, are you one of those people, Richard, that knew what you wanted to do ever since you were a kid?
Yes and no. I think I had an epiphany when I was about 19 or so where I realized that I did know and hadn't been paying attention to it. I was one of those guys that was in garage bands and stuff and was thinking I was going to be in rock and roll and whatnot. But then when I started getting into taking college a little more seriously in my late teens, I started thinking, and I got into my first journalism class and loved it. I started thinking, I've been doing this all along. Now that I think about it, yeah, I was in a newspaper when I was in middle school, and I've done some writing like this for different things. And a light bulb went off that, yeah, I've been writing my whole life in one form or another, and I like this. And yeah.
Southern Nightmare is not your only book. Tell us about your book about Betty Page.
Yeah, so that one is an interesting story. It has done very well. It came out in 1998 and was adapted into a film by HBO, which actually got released in theaters, called The Notorious Betty Page. Some people may have seen that movie. I've got a credit all the way at the very end of the movie. I think solely because they remembered at the very last minute they contractually had to put that in there. I collected comic books as a kid, really loved art. I had gone to a lot of different comic book stores and had started in the early 90s seeing these fanzines about Betty Page. And I didn't know who Betty Page was. Of course, I knew The Rocketeer, those comics, Dave Stevens, and I didn't realize, oh, hey, that's where he got his heroine for his comic from. And yeah, read a little bit and found out that there was this mystery that she had disappeared. I started thinking I'm going to do a little piece about the local fan following. And then I dug in and I ended up finding out she has a brother in Nashville and she's still alive, and ended up getting the first interview with her. It went from there. I ended up writing a biography of her.
Did you end up meeting with Ms. Page face to face?
Never did. Yeah, she sent me one letter. It was a 6-page, very nicely unlined stationery. Every line is sharp and steady and perfect penmanship of this former English teacher she had been at one point in her life. But no, I never did. And I have friends who did and people I know who did, but she was not happy with my reporting of some of the details of her life. And I'll be as upfront about that as I can be. It turned out that this became a true crime book because she had alluded to that she had some troubles during her time and didn't want to talk about it. And as I dug and started talking to people, I found out she had some severe mental health crises and had actually stabbed some people and nearly stabbed a roommate to death. In fact, it led to California changing some laws around matching roommates for elderly people. And I was still debating on whether or not to write that story when I interviewed a survivor of one of her attacks. And you could still hear, her name was Leonie Haddad, and I get chills thinking about it because you could still hear how scared she was. And I would have talked to her probably 13, 14 years after that attack, maybe more. I can't quite remember. And she still obviously was still traumatized. And I think that's when I realized there are victims involved and that this is a bigger story and it's not just her story. And I decided to tell the full story.
So she was a lot more than just a 50s pinup and burlesque queen.
And she was an iconic. She still has inspired tons of fashion photographers and designers and all kinds of, you'll see her influence and image everywhere once you see it. But yeah, it was a more difficult story there, a more human story and a fascinating story. But unfortunately, not everyone wants that story. I think a lot of people just want the sanitized, safe, cute pinup model story. And I think if you want that's there, there's other versions of that out there without all the other details. But yeah, there's more to it for sure.
Speaking of incredibly complex stories, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Southern Nightmare. The tagline for the book is The Hunt for the Southside Strangler. For anybody who's unfamiliar, can you give just a brief summary of the Southside Strangler case, please?
The bulk of the case takes place about 35 years ago when I was the kind of summer and fall of when I was about 16 years old, 1987. From September through November, 4 women were killed in Richmond and in Northern Virginia. They were killed in their homes brutally. It was bondage murders, really horrible. And it set the whole, I remember being a teenager, the entire city was terrified. The story ended up being a bigger story than that because there actually had been another murder that predated those back in 84. And there were a string of other attacks that were linked to these murders later. The amazing thing about this case is it was not only the first case in American history where DNA solved a murder, but the first case where DNA solved a serial killing. It was both. It was just astounding. It's a historic case. It's taught at criminal justice universities and classes. It deserves to be a lot better known.
And that really is something that was a theme with all of our comments on our Facebook page. A lot of people said, why don't I know about this case? This is so historic and so interesting. Why do you think the Southside Strangler murders have not received their proper place in the history of true crime and justice in this country?
I can't say entirely for sure why that is. It's not the first case in the world. There was one other case that predated it, Colin Pitchfork in England, which that name, you couldn't pick a better name for a serial killer. And that guy is actually out on parole right now. For those of us who follow the UK papers, he has been paroled, which is a little mind-blowing. I'm not sure I have a great answer why the case has been forgotten. I think there was one book written about it back in the 90s that was a little didactic, that was really heavy into the DNA and the science, that maybe just didn't catch the audience it should have, perhaps. And somehow and also I think the case was solved, which sometimes the unsolved cases tend to be the ones that get a little more attention. I don't know. I really don't know, but it's one that definitely deserves to be known more, and I hope I've done my part in trying to get it out there.
As Kristin says, there were a lot of questions and discussion on our social media pages about this. Why don't I know about this case? Why haven't I heard about this case? And the fact that it was so innovative from a forensic perspective. I think the factors you've cited are certainly part of it. I also wonder if this had happened in a larger city, if that might have made a difference. If Richmond was just a little too small, not that I consider Richmond a small town, far from it.
Yeah, it got national coverage. It did get national coverage when the arrest was made. I know I've seen clips from Time Magazine, from others. I know that it got some national coverage during the trials. Certainly, we can talk a little bit later, but I know Patricia Cornwell, the famous best-selling crime novelist, her first book was a very loosely adapted, not fictionalized version of these murders that inspired her on a career. I'm not exactly sure why these got lost to memory, and it's a case that deserves to be known.
What is it that sparked your interest in the case? Is it just because you remembered it and you lived through it? Has it always stayed with you, or is there something more to it than that?
There were a few factors. At the time, in 2017, I had a friend who was an editor at Style Weekly magazine here in Richmond, which is an alternative weekly, and I was a reporter there back in the mid-90s. They were looking to do something. They weren't sure what they wanted to do, but they wanted to do some kind of series, something true crime. They weren't sure what the story was. We all went away and did a little brainstorming, and within a couple of days, it became really obvious what the story was, because we all came upon it independently. We need to do the Southside Strangler story, because one of the victims had been an employee at Style. I did not work with her because she would have been killed about 10 years before I worked there, but she was friends of mine, people that I still am in touch with today. So I think there was that little feeling of there was one of our own who needed to be remembered. But I think also it quickly became, we realized, okay, the 30th anniversary of this case is coming up. In fact, the more we dug into it, we realized, okay, it was the 30th anniversary of the trials were coming up. We're already in the middle of the 30th anniversary of the killings. That whole fall during the 30th anniversary of the killings, I was talking to a lot of people who were connected with it, survivors, homicide detectives, FBI agents, family members, going to some of the places where the murders had taken place. I really spent a lot of that fall of 2017 and winter of 2018 doing a lot of research and a lot of interviews.
Talk to us a little bit about that research process. How do you go about getting all your information for a book like this? Is it just interviews, or do you have to dig into the microfiche or turn to Google? What do you do when you're ready to sit down and work on a project?
This one, I will say, was a lot easier than doing the Betty Page book, which I had written in the early to mid 90s, because that one I had to go to the Library of Congress to get access to some newspapers that were only available on microfiche and were not at my local library. There was no internet when I did that. And you had to use these reverse phone directories to look up where people had lived and where they went and what their names and numbers were, look up old census records. It was a great exercise back then. I mean, I learned a lot in tracking people and figuring things out. With the internet, with the resources we have today, it makes things a lot easier. I did have to go to the Library of Virginia in person to track down some old contemporaneous tapes from WRVA radio, their reportings of the murders and the trials. So I was able to find some of that. But a lot of it, I was able to find some archives online, like from our local paper of record, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and its afternoon paper, which is no longer with us, the News Leader. And they, of course, had done a ton of reporting back then. Style Weekly, of course, had done some too, and I had some of their materials. And another thing I really lucked out on, one of my predecessors at Style, another reporter, Lisa Bacon, she had covered the trial. Unknown to me, she said, come over by my house. I've got some stuff you might want to look at.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So I go over and sit down with Lisa. She has the entire trial transcript, which not even the courthouses had anymore.
Phenomenal.
She had all of this. She had all of this stuff and had hung on to it. That was probably, that was a tremendous resource, because it listed names, it listed witnesses, it listed direct testimony. It was fantastic.
Was she excited about the fact that you were working on a new project?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Lisa we've worked at so many places. She is also a reporter at Virginia Business, where I am now. She was a reporter at Style. Yeah. Lisa, I think, has always been in my court. she was really happy to help. And it was great getting to hear, because she had covered the court case. So I got her insights and that firsthand perspective of what it was like and what she remembered. And of course, you'll see in the book her recollections, because I interviewed her for this, and she stepped into Style. I think she went to work for Style like 2 weeks after the murder took place. And she talked about she came into this place 2 weeks after Debbie Davis, who was the person at Style who had been murdered.
Yes.
She said it was just like walking into some place that had a bomb thrown in it. Everybody was just walking around like zombies. And of course they would be. Again, murder case, there's going to be a lot of downer moments, but it was a great exercise. And I met some really fascinating people. I met an FBI agent who had also worked on the Atlanta child murders and had some really interesting thoughts and perspective on that, I just got to hear. And of course, the two homicide detectives, one from Arlington, one from Richmond, Joe Horgus from up in Arlington, and Ray Williams, who is no longer with us. Ray was the primary detective in Richmond. Both of them were retired, and both were very generous with their time.
These tapes that you found yourself going through, Richard, where were they stored and what formats were you listening to?
The WRVA tapes?
Yes.
They were on cassette. Somehow they were digitized as well. I can't quite remember. Somehow I got a digitized version of them. Sorry, this is going to be where
no, it's fine.
5 years later and lots of stuff has happened since. Mm-hmm. It's hard to remember all the details. But yeah, I know I worked with the librarians there, the research librarians at the Library of Virginia, who were stellar. And yeah, they helped me find a lot of this. And they have excellent archives there.
Yeah, shout out to the Library of Virginia, because they are amazing. If
Amen.
There's anybody like in our local listening area who's never had a chance to go to the Library of Virginia, do it. It is so cool.
Such a great resource for us to have.
Now, help me out as a person that doesn't live in Virginia. Who runs the Library of Virginia? Is this a state facility or?
State, yes. That's a state one.
But it's wonderful because they bring in lots of guest speakers. Our friend Kate Miles was speaking at the Library of Virginia a couple months back about her book Trailed, and they're really great about making sure that it's open and accessible to everybody through guest speakers and everything. It's very cool.
Yeah, Beth Macy, one of my former coworkers at Roanoke Times, who wrote Dope Sick. I think she's been there in the not too recent past. Yeah.
Let's get into the Patricia Cornwell of it all, because you did mention her before.
Sure.
So she did use the Southside Strangler case as a model for her first book, Postmortem, much in the same way that she would later use the Colonial Parkway murders as a model for All That Remains. Have you read Postmortem? And if so, can you assess how accurately she depicted the Southside Stranglings?
I'm just going to be upfront and say, no, I have not read it. I flipped through it selectively to look for certain information. Patricia Cornwell, she lived here in Richmond for a long time. A lot of people, my parents' generation, were huge fans of her. And a lot of people I knew, older journalists, knew her, but they all called her Patsy. I have never met her. I flipped selectively through Postmortem to get a little taste of where it was going. She had a tremendous front row seat because she was working in the state medical examiner's office at that time. A lot of people don't know that or they probably do. Around here, they know it, not so much maybe elsewhere, but she based her case Scarpetta character on Dr. Fierro, our former state medical examiner, who I interviewed for the book and who worked on this case, or the entire Southside Strangler case. And yeah, Patricia Cornwell, she had a front row seat working there in the medical examiner's office. And of course, she had been a local newspaper reporter before that. I think had a good eye for detail and was inspired to write this case. I think it is probably very fictionalized. What I saw of it, while I think there may be a few details, I don't think it's way, she's got a lot of stuff about odor and the killer being this diabolical mastermind who's out menacing the medical examiner, and none of that is true. I think it's sufficiently fictionalized beyond just some very basics that it's a bondage murders and things.
Yeah, Dr. Fierro also worked on the Colonial Parkway murders, and I've spoken to her as well some years back now. And she was a wonderful person and incredibly helpful. Boy, could you learn a lot talking to an expert like that. And
she is amazing. I did a profile on her years ago for Richmond Magazine when she was still state medical examiner. It was frustrating because she won't let you see her work.
Right.
You're not allowed in because this is not entertainment. She was the best advocate for, quote unquote, her patients. She did not see them as bodies or objects. She saw them as people. If that murder victim was somebody's mother, she treated them like a patient. And God bless her. She was an amazing expert forensic pathologist that we were very lucky to have in this state. And amazing woman, just fascinating.
We have certain opinions, Bill and I, about Patricia Cornwell's work because she very obviously based All That Remains on the Colonial Parkway murders. And that is something that we don't feel should be used as entertainment. So I'm just curious, do you have an opinion about using real crime as a basis for fictional work?
Yeah, and look, I'm going to come at this from saying I don't, obviously I can understand where Bill's coming from completely. I very much respect where Bill is as a family member of a murder victim. Having also had someone close to me murdered, if that were fictionalized, I don't know how I would feel. That said, I think just looking at it from a literary basis and also as a writer myself, I think you can't help but lots and lots of writers, almost going back to the dawn of detective fiction, have used true cases as an inspiration to write from. I think there's a million pastiches of Sherlock Holmes modern interpretations. Holmes meets Jack the Ripper and tracks him down. And I'm pretty sure Arthur Conan Doyle took some inspiration for some of his Holmes cases from some real things too. Yeah, I guess the question is it sufficiently fictionalized? Is there sufficient distance? Are you doing harm? I think those are all questions that probably should be asked. I think Patricia Cornwell was writing almost contemporaneously. Her book about Southside Strangling killings came out, a year or two after the killings. It was and I think the same thing with the Parkway.
Right.
I don't think there was a lot of distance.
It's about 3 years. And here's one area where I'll push back: solved versus unsolved. There's a lot of myths now that have gotten mixed in with the Colonial Parkway murders, and many of them started with Patricia Cornwell and All That Remains. In terms of creating confusion, kind of urban myths that have become part of this case, when you start drilling down, you realize, oh, this is in the book. And people read the book and they think that's an accurate telling of the Colonial Parkway murders story, which obviously it's not. And then we can let this topic go because I don't want to turn this into a rant. There is a tremendous amount of detail in All That Remains that is lifted directly from excruciating detail that only someone with access would be able to write with this level of specificity, particularly about issues and details that didn't even come out until later. They may have come out in the years since because I've been outspoken, Kristin and other family members have been outspoken in our interviews as we continue to pressure the FBI and the Virginia State Police. And so more detail has come out about those murders in the 30 plus years since. I think there's a big difference in if you're writing a story that's about a case that's solved or a case that is hundreds of years ago, like Jack the Ripper.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree. Yeah. And I think it comes down to that. Are you doing harm? Are you putting information out there that could harm a case? I can't speak because I've never written fiction, so I can't speak from that side of the fence. But I can say, having been a journalist, I have been privy sometimes to things that I've known that the general public doesn't know about murders or about certain cases when I've been asked, hey, we need you not to say that. And that's sometimes where in journalism you get to make little deals where, okay, I cannot say that. Can you give me something else I can use or something? And that's part of the back and forth you develop with sources. Yeah, there's definite times when you have to realize there's a public good to consider as well. Yeah, that's concerning if there are details there that should not be there.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Now, Southern Nightmare not only was a fantastic book, but it was also a podcast as well. And so what were your goals ultimately for the book and for the podcast? Was it just to bring awareness to the case, or do you have other goals in mind when you sat down to write this and then to bring it to the podcast space?
I think initially we were just looking to tell a good story. I think we saw, okay, that there's the story that really that's been forgotten. One of the people who worked at Style was a victim of this. We think, okay, 30 years later, all of the people who were connected with it are getting a lot older. We may be losing some of them. We did lose Ray. Ray Williams died not too long after the podcast aired. So we knew we were under a little bit of a ticking clock there. So yeah, I would say from a journalistic perspective, we were looking to tell a good story that had been forgotten. However, once I got into the digging in and started looking at this and talking to people and realized, hold on a second, this may be the first case in U.S. history solved with DNA. What's going on here? Why don't more people know about this? And so then I think it became a little background on me. My father was deputy chief of the county I lived in, Henrico County. He was a 30-some year police veteran. And I grew up interested in law enforcement. Never really considered it as a career because my dad just told me he didn't want me doing that. But I think I had always had an interest in crime and law enforcement, all that, just because having my dad and hearing stories and things. When I heard, okay, we had the first case DNA right here in Richmond and nobody remembers it, I'm thinking, this is the story. This is the story that needs to be told. This story needs to be brought back to the public consciousness and given some real prominence.
Did the book come first or did the podcast come first?
The podcast came first, and then the book came very fast behind it. I had a media partnership deal with Style. I did this independently of Style as my own enterprise, but I had a deal with them where they would get a written excerpt each week from the podcast. For 10 weeks, we had the episodes airing. Style was airing installments of the stories, which started with a cover story in Style. And we kicked it off with a live event at VCU. And then once we finished, I had a live show where we did the last episode, a live performance. And then after that, I decided I've got all this material here. I think I can make a book out of this. I've already written a lot. And I was still piecing together some things. Like, for instance, you'll hear in the podcast, I was equivocating on the DNA a little bit because I wasn't sure, because there was another case that was going through right at the same time, more or less, as the Southside Strangler case. So there was some question from different people about, okay, which one was the first? Believe me, I was still doing interviews, still doing research. Sometimes as a basis of things that were being aired, I would get calls from people saying, oh, hey, you didn't interview. I was still doing reporting all the way up to the very end of the podcast. And
Wow.
It was crazy. Outside of work, outside of my full-time job I had then, I was working probably another 20, 30 hours more a week at nights and weekends. By the time all of this finished, I had collected enough information and was able to definitively say, yes, this was the first DNA case. I'd been able to do enough digging. And also, I just had so many little things that we didn't have room for in the podcast. So many little things that got left on the cutting room floor, so many interesting little tangents and side things I dug up that I think it made for some extra material in the book that I think if you like the podcast, you'll still find some new stuff in the book.
Let's go ahead and turn to listener questions about Southern Nightmare. I want to start with the first question, and this is from fellow author Lindsay Wade, who just had a book come out and whose book is actually going to be our next pick for our book club. So Lindsay writes, my question is whether or not there has been confirmation that Timothy Spencer's DNA was added to Virginia's DNA database. The database was created in 1989 and he was executed in 1994. I'm curious if Virginia went back and collected from death row inmates after the database went into effect, since this is not always the case.
I don't know for certain. I would think yes, but I'm not certain. Dr. Paul Ferreira, who unfortunately is no longer with us, he was director of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, and he established that databank, which again, another first that Virginia created, the first DNA database in the country. And that's what the FBI's database ended up getting based on. And he established that here, and it was established more or less as a direct result of the Southside Strangler case. So I would have to think that yes, because that case was what kicked it off. And also they knew that there were other attacks. There were a string of rapes in addition to the 5 murders. And they did find those connections. They did make connections to some of those where there was some evidence left. Yeah, I would think it would have to be.
I'm only going to push back lightly here because I can't comment specifically about Virginia, but we have been disappointed numerous times in that people who you would think, I'm talking about convicted killers, people on death row, people that have even been executed, whose DNA is not in the system in the way that you would think it should be, for a variety of reasons. And there's an undercurrent here nationally that there are tens of thousands of people whose DNA clearly belongs in the CODIS system, and their DNA is not in the system, including people that are currently incarcerated on death row now. And the states, and again, this is not a shot at Virginia, and it's not a comment about Virginia per se, the states are completely dropping the ball.
Is it a resources issue, Bill? Is it?
It's a lot of different things. There are questions about whether or not it's legal to go back and collect people's DNA, potentially forcibly. In other words, some of these people are refusing to allow their DNA to be taken. And there's question, particularly at the state level in various states around the country, as to whether or not you can obligate someone to be forced to give their DNA.
I thought that had already been settled. Yeah, that's interesting. That's something I wasn't aware of. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very disturbing.
Because look at the Golden State Killer. So many cases in different jurisdictions. That case was similar to this one in that he was committing crimes sometimes an hour or two drives apart, just like this one. And they didn't realize that those were connected, just like this one. And then some of those the dots got connected by DNA. And with the propensity for repeat offenders, yeah, I'm with you. That it seems to me to be a no-brainer that these people should be in the database.
Our next question is from Sarah G. It's a bit of a long one, so I need a preface. So Sarah G asks, the Diane Cho case really bugs me. It was completely different from the other crimes. There were two hypotheses proposed in the book. Louis Schlesinger said that it was possible an escalation in risk behavior, which is not uncommon in serial killers. And two, one of the detectives said maybe Spencer thought Diane was a young single woman because her parents worked so much and were out of the house. Sarah is curious about which theory you hold with for this case, Richard.
I think from what we do know of serial killers, what I have learned from talking with criminal justice experts, they do escalate in behavior. One thing leads to another for various reasons. I cannot say myself, I don't think Timothy Spencer, the Southside Strangler, was the kind of person that would have cared how old a person was. I don't think that mattered to him. I think what mattered to him was, did the idea of attacking them push his buttons, and were they an easy person to attack? Could he access them? And I think she was vulnerable because she had, there was a way to get into her room. Her parents were not there very often, so it looked like a woman who was on her own, or at least I think it was more about, again, I think a lot of times with serial killers, people want things to make sense. They want there to be some kind of logic on what they do. Sometimes there are just monsters. Sometimes there are just people who just want to do awful things because it gets them excited. And that's not a great thing. That's not something that anybody really wants to accept or believe. And I think she unfortunately was vulnerable, and he saw those vulnerabilities.
Very good question from Sarah. So we have two from Amber. The first one I thought was particularly interesting because I love theme questions. She says, nightmares are obviously a theme throughout the book. Did you have any nightmares during your research and writing process for this? This is tough material.
It is. Short answer, yes. I don't know that I could say necessarily what they were, just because I don't know that I remember, but I know I had some. I think it is very difficult to live, breathe, eat, sleep this I did it for about 13, 14 months between when I started the research on the project and published the book. Yeah, it is awful stuff that sticks in your head. And you think about this case in particular spoke to somebody who violated home and hearth, who violated the safety and sanctity of people's homes. It was such a violation, just not only their bodies, but just the basic decency of everything, of just what you expect to be safe when you're in your own home. And I think, yeah, it's hard not to feel that and to feel the fear and awfulness of that and to have some of the stuff pop up in your head. It's not a fun place to be. My hat is off to homicide detectives and people who are able to work in this field because Lord knows they're needed, especially good ones and talented ones. And that really is a case, that's a job that eats some people up alive. Yeah, I can't see doing this all the time. I think once I was done with this, I needed a break from it. I don't really think I have listened to true crime podcasts or anything since that, to be honest with you. I think I just needed to get away from it.
That is 100% understandable.
I had the same thought. Understandable was the word that came to mind.
Second question from Amber. She asked about Rena. She said, did Rena's murder ever get investigated any further? And besides the fibers that were found, was there anything else forensically connecting her former roommate or someone else to the crime?
I can say that I think that case still bothers some retired law enforcement. I know there were a lot of rumors around that case. I think I was able to disprove one of those rumors, but I will say I just got a call not too long ago from somebody who was former law enforcement saying that they're still digging into it on the side. I don't know that anything will ever come out of that because it's been so long. I don't know what evidence, if any, still exists. Yeah, my knowledge is there was not a whole lot connecting the former roommate other than circumstance and some fiber analysis. But given the circumstances, it doesn't seem unlikely that he did it, but it's hard to know. I don't think it was a Timothy Spencer murder. I really don't, from everything I've heard. But yeah, I do know that it's something that still interests former law enforcement folks. I don't know that there's ever going to be a resolution, but some of them are still bugged by it.
I have an additional question as well, Richard. Southern Nightmare is such an amazing book and podcast series. Was this ever optioned for a film or television show?
No, I think partly because I didn't have time to do the marketing and the legwork on it, and partly because I decided to do it. My Betty Page book had been done through a traditional publisher, right, and with resources and an organization that did successfully sell the film rights. With this one, I decided to self-publish and do my own company because I wanted to see, okay, if I do that, do I get a bigger share of royalties, blah, blah, blah. I think what I was forgetting is you also have to do all the marketing. And
yes,
there's a big piece of the puzzle there that I was missing and that I did not have time to really devote myself to. That said, yeah, I think it would make a tremendous miniseries or a documentary. Unfortunately, some of the folks are past, but it's a tremendous story. To me, it's every bit as interesting and compelling as some of the things that I've seen from Netflix and such.
I think we both feel the same way.
Absolutely. And we've really already addressed, I'd say, the biggest listener question of all, which is why this case just doesn't seem to be better known. The final listener question that we have is from Sam, who just says, hey, what is your next project? I'd love to know what else you're planning on working on.
Bill knows that when I was finishing Southern Nightmare, I was actually interested in the Colonial Parkway, and that was where I was thinking about, and I had some ideas on that one.
Please come over, join us.
So that's how Bill and I met. But as pretty much right after Southern Nightmare wrapped up and I'd taken a little rest for a couple of months, I got offered the editorship of Virginia Business. Since then, just being the head of this business magazine, it pretty much takes all of my time. We do great work and it's a busy publication, busy staff. Right now, it doesn't leave time for things on the side, unfortunately. I'd love to do another season of Southern Nightmare. I've got ideas for lots of things and I'm hoping I'll get to come back to it sometime.
The book and the podcast is Southern Nightmare, The Hunt for the Southside Strangler. And Richard, if people want to buy this, where can they buy it?
Amazon.
All right. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Had a great time.
We hope that everyone has enjoyed our first selection for the Mind Over Murder Book Club, Southern Nightmare. We will put up some links and resources in our show notes so that you can locate the podcast, and we will announce our next book club selection very shortly. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.